My journey on Thursday and Friday didn't unfold quite the way I'd expected. I had plans to attend a conference in Minneapolis, but things started going off track even before I left. Typically, Rachel would take half the day off to see me off in her usual warm, supportive way, but this time, all I got was a quick peck on the cheek before she rushed off to work like she couldn't wait to be out the door. I'm Ethan, by the way, 49 years old, married to Rachel for 24 years. We have 2 kids, Noah, who's 22, and Honora, who just turned 20. I set out for the airport at 3 p.m., leaving work and heading straight there. I always aim to arrive early for my 6 p.m. flights. I've never been one for last-minute stress. At first, everything seemed routine as I settled in to wait for the boarding call. But luck had other plans. A brutal snowstorm was rolling in, and soon enough, my flight was delayed by 45 minutes. We finally boarded, and I thought we'd gotten past the worst of it. But 30 minutes into the air, I noticed we were veering left. I brushed it off at first as a minor adjustment, but then it was clear we were turning back. The pilot soon confirmed it. The weather had gotten so bad that we couldn't safely land in Minneapolis, so we'd have to return to our departure airport. Once back, I hurried to rebook, determined to make it to Minneapolis the next morning. Thankfully, I snagged one of the last seats on an early flight. Even though I'd missed part of the conference, I still held out hope of salvaging the trip. I called my Minneapolis contact to explain the delay, then left a voicemail for my boss with all the details. Feeling a bit on edge, I called home next, hoping to hear Rachel's voice, something steady and familiar. But there was no answer, and when I got back to the house, it was completely dark, her car gone from the driveway. I left my bags in the car and cautiously stepped inside. The sound of voices from the living room startled me, but it was only the TV, still on from when she must have last been home. I knew I'd turned it off before leaving. My stomach tightened with unease as I switched it off, searching the house for any sign of her but finding nothing. With a shaky hand, I dialed her cell, and when she finally picked up, her voice was warm as she asked, almost too casually, where I was. This was her usual question, but now it carried a strange, almost forced curiosity. She said she was home, watching TV, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Sitting there in the quiet house, exhaustion started weighing on me. All I wanted was to feel her there with me, even just for a bit of comfort. But the more I thought about it, the less I felt at ease. This wasn't the homecoming I'd been hoping for, and the gnawing suspicion I tried to brush off earlier started creeping back in. Instead of Rachel's usual warmth, all I felt was a heavy cloud of doubt. Had she been lying to me? And if so, why? A long silence stretched between us until she asked, sounding a little concerned, if I was still on the line. Snapping back, I muttered, "Yeah, we just landed back at O'Hare. I'll talk to you later," and hung up. When she called again, I shut my phone off. I just needed space to make sense of the mess of thoughts swirling in my head. I sank onto the couch, numb, wondering why Rachel would lie. A rational part of me clung to the idea that maybe there was some innocent explanation, a surprise maybe. Like the elaborate plan I'd put together for our 20th anniversary, where I'd kept secrets for months to surprise her with a cruise. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, I couldn't convince myself this was anything like that. In a flash of hope, I thought maybe Honora knew something. I dialed her number from memory, and soon her cheerful voice came through. After a bit of small talk, I carefully asked if she'd heard anything unusual from her mom, maybe hints of a surprise plan. Honora thought for a moment, then told me they just had their usual Sunday call, but nothing out of the ordinary came up. Disappointed, I pressed a little more, telling her I had a strange feeling that Rachel might be planning something, maybe even for my upcoming birthday. But Honora gently reminded me we'd already celebrated it last month. Feeling deflated, I wished her a good night and hung up, the pit in my stomach growing. The hopes I'd been clinging to about some innocent explanation faded, replaced by a lingering question I couldn't shake. Why would Rachel lie to me? My mind searched for possible reasons. Maybe it had something to do with her job, a promotion even, though I couldn't quite see why she'd need to lie for that. Recently, Rachel had been working late more and more often, claiming her dedication was necessary for her promotion. But somewhere deep down, I knew she understood that no career step was worth the time we were losing together. She knew how much I wanted her to ease up on her work hours so we could spend more time as a couple. A few months before our 20th anniversary, I had faced a similar dilemma myself. I turned down a promotion then. About 5 years back, I'd been offered the position of vice president of finance at my company. It was a prestigious role that came with a lot of travel to our headquarters in Chicago and frequent visits to factories across the country. At first, I was thrilled by the opportunity, but Rachel wasn't. She didn't hesitate to voice her doubts, and I could tell she was uneasy about the idea. I couldn't ignore the story of a colleague who'd accepted a similar role, only to wind up divorced within 2 years. He had more money, sure, but it had come at the cost of his marriage and his happiness. Rachel's concerns made sense, too. Our kids were still in school and needed us. She was clear she didn't want to shoulder the responsibility of raising them alone if I was going to be out of town all the time. We had some serious conversations, and eventually I came to my senses. I realized that my family meant more to me than any paycheck or title. So, with a heavy heart, I turned down the promotion, choosing my family over my career. Now, as I watched Rachel chase her own promotion, I found myself wondering if I'd made the right choice. Our kids were grown and out of the house, leaving just the two of us. Rachel seemed to think her new role wouldn't disrupt our lives much, aside from a few extra business trips, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd end up spending endless hours at the office. I already felt the strain of her absence, seeing her only briefly each night before she'd collapse into bed, too worn out to talk or even share a meal. The lack of time and intimacy weighed on me, and it had been so long since we'd had a real moment together that I couldn't even recall the last time we'd connected in that way. Yes, maybe age had something to do with it, but that didn't ease the disappointment. I began to wonder if her dodgy answers and that strange phone call earlier were just her way of brushing off my concerns, using work as a convenient excuse. To get a clearer answer, I decided to call her direct line at the advertising agency where she worked. I wasn't expecting to be thrown off guard, but instead of Rachel's voice, I heard her colleague Ben Taylor on the other end. Trying to keep my cool, I greeted him with the nickname I always used, expecting he'd hand the phone over to Rachel. But what he said next threw me completely. "Oh, hey, aren't you supposed to be on vacation with Rachel?" he asked casually. My heart skipped a beat. I managed to collect myself and, after a moment, asked what he meant by that. Ben sounded surprised, explaining that Rachel had taken the week off and owed him lunch for covering her shifts. "It's past 9 here, and I'm still stuck at work," he added with an edge of frustration before hanging up. Stunned, I pieced together the details as they sank in. Rachel wasn't at work. She was supposedly on vacation. But where was she, and who was she with? A chill crept over me as an unwelcome thought began to take shape. I'd always been the type to believe in the good in people, especially in Rachel, but now, for the first time, I found myself doubting her. Could she really be deceiving me? The first thought that crossed my mind was maybe she was with her sister, Maya. We'd grown distant from Maya and her ex-husband, Lucas, over the years, but there was a time when we were all incredibly close. We used to spend countless evenings together, looking after each other's kids, celebrating birthdays, organizing family gatherings, and even vacationing as a group. But things had shifted one day, in a way that I'd never fully recovered from. I remember coming home with a pounding headache, desperate for some quiet. I took a couple of Tylenol and lay on the couch, hoping to rest. Not long after, Rachel and Maya came back from a shopping trip, laughing and talking. They didn't notice me lying there, and it wasn't until I heard Maya's voice that I realized I wasn't going to be resting anytime soon. Maya mentioned something offhandedly about a new product manager she'd seen at the grocery store, asking Rachel if she'd noticed him. My stomach tightened as I listened, dreading what might come next. Rachel laughed and admitted she'd noticed he was attractive, even said he'd smiled at her. Then, in a playful tone, Maya joked, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, it'd be even better if he were smiling after our little rendezvous in the back seat yesterday." My heart dropped as Rachel, rather than reacting with the shock I expected, simply warned Maya not to get caught, telling her she could risk losing her marriage. But Maya just brushed it off, saying she was always careful. They moved on as if nothing happened, leaving me on the couch with my head spinning. Honesty and integrity had always been at the heart of my values, and hearing that exchange shattered something inside me. I didn't know what to think, but I knew one thing for certain. Lucas needed to know what his wife had been up to. Knowing that Lucas would be devastated by Maya's betrayal weighed heavily on me. I imagined how heartbroken he'd be and realized he might even kick her out once he found out. The thought of being the one to deliver news that could end a marriage wasn't something I took lightly. I kept asking myself, did I really want to be responsible for changing their lives so drastically? Before I could decide, Rachel came home with our kids. Seeing how strongly she disapproved of her sister's behavior made me feel a bit better, like maybe she'd help me figure out what to do. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, I cautiously brought up what I'd overheard, telling Rachel about the infidelity I discovered within our circle. Her initial reaction was shock, and as I asked for advice, I could see the uncertainty on her face. I wondered if confronting the cheater with anger was the right approach, but Rachel suggested it depended on the situation and that there were different factors to consider. To get her honest opinion, I used a hypothetical example, asking if she thought we'd ignore it if Lucas had been unfaithful, maybe meeting a woman at a bar. I wanted to see where she stood. The tension in the room was thick as I mulled over the possible ways to handle this mess. Suddenly, Rachel sat up, gripping her phone, her face set with determination. She was ready to call Maya right then and confront her. Instinctively, I gently took the phone from her and assured her I'd handle it myself. Rachel looked at me with uncertainty, asking what was going on. I told her I knew what I needed to do, hoping Maya would finally face the consequences of her actions. Rachel, resolute, stated that if Lucas kicked Maya out, she wouldn't let her stay with us. She refused to offer a place to someone who'd been unfaithful. With that sense of purpose, I called Lucas. He answered warmly, greeting me as his favorite son-in-law. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. After hesitating, I finally told him I'd overheard something troubling, something that would be hard to share. I revealed that Maya had cheated on him, as recently as the previous day. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, and when Lucas finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, full of disbelief. He asked if I was sure it was really his Maya, and I confirmed, explaining I'd heard it directly from her, with no shame on her part. I offered my condolences and told him he could count on our support through whatever came next. Lucas thanked me quietly before hanging up, and I was left feeling the full weight of what I just set in motion. Rachel's sad eyes met mine, glistening with tears. She whispered that she was proud of me and pulled me into a hug, a fragile comfort in the face of such upheaval. After we settled, I suggested that Lucas and Maya might want to see a therapist to work through everything. Rachel sighed, saying she wasn't sure therapy could change much, given that people who stray once often do it again. I nodded, sharing her quiet resignation. Sometime in the middle of the night, the phone rang, jarring me awake. I answered, trying not to wake Rachel. Maya was on the other end, her voice furious as she demanded to know what I'd told Lucas. I replied calmly, saying I'd told him the truth and that honesty had been long overdue. Maya's voice grew more enraged, accusing me of betrayal. I stood firm, saying that sometimes the truth catches up, and cheaters eventually face the consequences of their actions. I could hear her crying as she admitted Lucas had thrown her out. She asked desperately if she could stay with us, but I told her we couldn't take in someone who'd broken such a fundamental trust. I explained she'd have to find somewhere else to go. Her shock and frantic pleas over the phone became almost panicked. Turning to Rachel, I asked her what I should say next, seeking her support. Rachel leaned in and spoke firmly into the phone, saying she didn't want a cheater in her house and that Maya needed to find her own place. With that, I delivered our final message together. Maya was no longer welcome in our lives. She was not to visit or call. Rachel then snuggled into me, whispering that she was proud of the way I'd handled things, and in each other's arms, we finally drifted off to a restless sleep. But the next morning brought a new blow. Rachel's father called, his voice heated with anger, demanding to know why we'd turned our backs on Maya. After the call, Rachel was visibly shaken, her face wet with tears as she looked to me for reassurance. I reminded her we'd made this decision together, knowing it was the right choice. I explained that I had only used a hypothetical example of Lucas cheating to gauge her opinion and hadn't suggested it actually happened. Then I asked a hard question. Why should Maya's betrayal be treated any differently than if it had been Lucas's? Rachel seemed conflicted, defending her sister by saying that Maya was family. I felt a pang of disappointment, and I asked if she really thought it was okay to excuse cheating just because it was her sister. For a moment, Rachel was silent, unable to justify her stance. 3 years ago, I'd already had a difficult conversation with Rachel. I told her that I didn't want Maya around our children or in our home. Over time, Rachel would occasionally sneak off to see Maya, an unspoken taboo in our house. She'd visit her sister on the sly whenever I was away. Lucas eventually moved on, even preparing to remarry, and I stopped caring about Maya altogether. Her absence brought a sense of relief, and I just didn't think about her anymore. But seeing Rachel so tangled up in all this stirred something in me, and I felt it was time to clear the air. Part of me suspected that Rachel might even feel guilty for hiding her visits, though at this point, I wasn't as invested as I used to be. Then, strangely, I found myself standing in front of a huge audience at a conference, delivering a speech. I was talking about 2 types of people: those who ignore reality and those who confront it. While I spoke, Rachel's boss, Tom Collins, raised his hand, and with a strange look on his face, he said he'd been avoiding my wife. Then Ben Taylor, seated behind him, nodded and admitted he'd been keeping his distance from her, too. Someone else threw in a sarcastic comment, and the crowd chuckled, lightening the mood. Suddenly, I jolted awake on the couch, wiping drool off my face. It was past midnight. I drifted off for over an hour, and a quick glance around told me Rachel hadn't come home. Maybe she'd been in and out without realizing I was here. I got up and went to the bedroom, but found no sign of her. A strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe she was with Maya. I hesitated, considering calling Maya to see if Rachel was with her. But then I realized I didn't even know where she was living these days. As I started scrolling through my phone, looking for any saved contacts, I spotted the Find My Phone app. Last year, after losing my phone on a New York to Cincinnati flight, I'd installed it on both our devices. It was worth a shot, so I opened the app and waited as it processed the search. A few seconds later, her location popped up: Mills Lake. I stared at the screen, confused. What was she doing there? Mills Lake was known for its upscale properties, cottages that went for much more than our modest home, and Maya certainly couldn't afford a place there. Curiosity took over, so I opened Google Earth to pinpoint her exact location. My jaw dropped when I realized she was in a high-end estate surrounded by a huge stone wall. Why on earth would Rachel be at a luxurious mansion like that? The lake was an hour away, but I couldn't let this go. I needed to know the truth. Confronting Rachel directly wouldn't get me anywhere. I'd probably just hear another excuse or lie. I needed proof. My mind raced as I drove, chastising myself for not digging into this sooner. The what-ifs started to pile up as I approached Mills Lake, unsure of what I'd find but hoping for some simple explanation that would make this all go away. As I pulled up to the estate, I saw an imposing gate blocking the drive. I wasn't about to walk right up to the front door and announce myself. Parking right on the road would only attract attention in a neighborhood like this, so I drove a bit further until I found a small path where I could tuck my car out of sight. Stepping out, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. How was I supposed to get past that wall? Then it dawned on me. The estate bordered the lake. If I approached from the water, I might be able to get a view without being noticed. With my pulse pounding, I made my way along the shore, searching for a way into the property from that side. Eventually, I found a narrow path that led closer to the house. Relying on the locator app again, I found my way to a sprawling mansion. The second-floor lights were on, though the ground floor was mostly dim. One curtain was left slightly open, and through it, I could see a warm glow spilling outside. Spotting a sturdy tree, I climbed up until I could peer inside. A man in a white terrycloth robe crossed my view briefly before disappearing into another room. He looked older and unfamiliar, Moments later, Maya stepped into view, wrapped in an open robe, a glass of champagne in hand. She looked surprisingly well-kept for her age, as if indulging in this new lifestyle suited her. As I watched, it all started to come together. Rachel was here, likely pulled into this lifestyle of excess by her sister. The consequences of a divorce, the financial strain, it was starting to explain Maya's actions. But it wasn't a life I wanted for Rachel, and I feared she was being drawn into something damaging. Then the man reappeared, slipping his hands around Maya, taking her champagne glass and setting it aside as he began to kiss her. I turned away, feeling the bitter sting of seeing such hollow, shallow intimacy that was nothing like the love and commitment I valued. Just as I was about to climb down, I saw her. Rachel sat on a distant couch, her face flushed with a foolish, drunken smile, her robe hanging open. My heart stopped. In that instant, everything I believed about our marriage shattered. I stepped back, my foot slipping as I lost my balance and tumbled from the tree. Branches scratched and scraped as I fell, but thankfully, I only ended up with minor bruises. Dazed and shaken, I pulled myself up, the weight of what I'd seen settling heavily on my chest. Everything had changed in a single night. I stumbled back to my car, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened, and tears filled my eyes. The pain wasn't from the fall but from the heartbreak of losing the woman I'd loved for so long. As I limped to the car, a wild thought crossed my mind. Maybe I should storm into that mansion and confront them both. But the consequences, jail time, assault charges, held me back. I knew that wasn't the answer. As I sat there, a storm of emotions churned inside me. The betrayal was undeniable now, a truth I couldn't escape. Anger rose in waves, but I knew I had to keep it in check. No matter how hurt I was, I'd never resort to violence against Rachel. Instead, I considered my options. The simplest one, just go home, pack my things, and walk away. If we lived in a no-fault divorce state, it could be clean and straightforward. We had separate incomes, no kids at home. It would be easy to split our lives down the middle. Still, a part of me wanted some justice, a way to let her know I was onto her deceit. An idea took shape. I picked up my phone and dialed Rachel, knowing she probably wouldn't answer, and I'd go straight to voicemail. I hoped she'd check it right away. "Hi, honey," I said into the recording, keeping my tone as casual as I could muster. "I tried calling the home phone, but you didn't answer, so I thought I'd try your cell. Just wanted to give you a heads up not to be surprised when you hear my keys in the door in a few minutes." I went on, explaining my flight delay due to a blizzard and that we'd had to divert to Chicago. I told her I'd be home in about 30 minutes. After hanging up, I imagined her seeing the voicemail notification, the little spike of curiosity she'd feel. Why was I leaving a message this late? Maybe she'd even panic a bit, piecing together her story in case I caught her off guard. I wondered if she'd be too drunk to realize it wasn't possible to use a cell phone mid-flight, but I hoped her conscience would do the work for me. Then my phone rang, snapping me back to reality. It was Rachel, likely trying to gauge my exact arrival time. I answered in a weary tone, apologizing for waking her, and she reassured me it was fine, telling me she was on her way home and would be there in about an hour. I acknowledged her reply, and she hung up quickly. Not long after, I saw her car speeding out of the estate gates, swerving dangerously. My stomach twisted as I watched, realizing just how intoxicated she must have been. My heart ached at what our life had turned into, but seeing her reckless driving reminded me of something more significant. She wasn't just risking her own life. She was endangering everyone else on the road. Despite my anger, the thought of something terrible happening to her, the mother of my children, was unbearable. Determined to ensure her safety, I called emergency services, describing her erratic driving and providing details of her car. I emphasized the urgency of stopping her before she hurt herself or someone else. The operator assured me that a patrol car was on the way. Keeping a safe distance, I followed her, watching as she weaved through traffic. 2 exits later, I spotted a patrol car speeding toward her, lights flashing, and watched as it pulled her over. I drove past, a complicated mix of relief and sadness settling in my chest. When I got home about 45 minutes later, the irony of it all hit me like a wave. In a single night, the woman I'd once trusted with my life had unraveled it, setting in motion a chain of events that could have ended in a tragedy. The idea that our children could have lost their mother because of her recklessness was sobering. I sat there, letting the enormity of it sink in. I knew right then that love was no longer guiding my decisions. It wasn't that I'd stopped loving her entirely, but I couldn't see any future for us anymore. I needed time to process everything, so I turned off the home phone and silenced my mobile, wanting a bit of peace. As I reflected, it hit me. The simplest explanation for her deception had been staring me in the face the whole time, and I'd been too blind to see it. Disappointment washed over me, both in her and in myself for not seeing the truth sooner. I poured myself a glass of wine, thinking back on all the years I'd believed our love would deepen over time, like a fine wine. But now, faced with the bitter truth of our broken marriage, it felt like that love had soured into vinegar, leaving me with nothing but pain. Her betrayal cut deeply, but the wound went beyond the act itself. It was the realization that 26 years of love and commitment had withered away. Without her, I felt adrift, like a lost soul, stripped of purpose and identity. Could I go on without the love we'd built our lives around? For a moment, the pain was so intense I considered sinking into the depths of the river beneath the bridge near our home, a place to escape this suffering. Starting a new life felt like an insurmountable mountain. How do you map out a future when the person who was your everything is gone? For years, my family had been my world. Every decision, every sacrifice I made was for the happiness of Rachel and our children. I'd never been the social type outside of work functions. Our family was my life. Now, with the kids grown and out on their own, it was supposed to be our time, just me and Rachel. But now, I was left completely alone, drowning in sadness, struggling with a loneliness I'd never felt before. Why had she chosen this path? Why resort to cheating when a clean divorce, as painful as it might have been, would have respected the years we spent together? Had she fallen out of love and merely stayed for convenience until the kids moved out? When had her care and warmth faded? While I'd seen our empty nest as a new chapter, a chance to rekindle what we had, Rachel clearly saw it differently. But then, I thought of Noah and Honora, and they became my reason to keep going. Every decision I'd ever made was for the well-being of Rachel and our kids. Family was everything to me, and now, with the kids grown and gone, I'd hoped to invest more in our relationship. But now, I was alone, facing a future I hadn't planned for. She'd chosen this path, throwing away everything we'd built. If she no longer wanted our life together, why hadn't she just ended it? When had she stopped caring? As these thoughts swirled in my mind, the path forward became clearer. I couldn't stay here anymore. I decided to pack what little I needed, some clothes, my laptop, my car keys, and disappear, leaving no trace. With a renewed sense of purpose, I gathered my things, packing quickly. By the time I was done, it was just before 6 a.m., exhausted but resolute. I took a short nap, sure that Rachel would be tied up until late in the morning. At 9 o'clock, my phone's alarm woke me. I scheduled an urgent meeting with a lawyer, then took a long, hot shower, letting go of the last fragments of my old life. I removed my wedding ring and set it on the table next to the phone, a silent marker of the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Before leaving, I wrote Rachel a letter. It felt pointless to try to talk to her face to face, but I needed to express how I felt. Rachel, it breaks my heart to realize you've chosen a path of recklessness and emptiness, following the same pattern as your sister. By the time you read this, I'll have left your life entirely. Your betrayal has left me in unimaginable pain, but despite it all, I'm grateful for the happiness we once shared and for our children. I'll keep this brief. May you find whatever it is you're seeking in your new life, far away from our broken family. Did any of this bring you the satisfaction you craved? I want no further contact with you. We have nothing left to discuss. Our lawyers will handle everything, and I ask that you sign the divorce papers promptly. Ethan. By 10 a.m., I was at the bank, settling our shared debts, closing accounts, and making sure there was enough to cover the mortgage and bills for a couple of months. I withdrew everything else, leaving with a check for around $250,000. Before noon, I arrived at work, where my boss was surprised to see me instead of getting an update from Minnesota. I shared my plans to leave, surprising him even further. He and I had grown beyond a typical boss-employee relationship. He'd once kept his position because I declined a promotion, and he'd been grateful ever since. When he went through his own divorce 2 years ago, I told him my choice had been influenced by family. Understanding my need for a fresh start, he offered me a position in their new Texas division. We shook on it, agreeing he'd say I'd left voluntarily. Next, I met with my lawyer to explain my decision to divorce Rachel. I instructed him to serve her the papers and gave her power of attorney to sell the house. My lawyer, who'd been a family friend, tried to suggest alternatives but saw the determination in my face. Around 8 o'clock that evening, completely drained, I found a small, dated motel to rest for the night. I lay on the bed, exhausted yet hopeful, knowing I was finally taking steps toward a new life. Using a prepaid phone I'd picked up earlier, I dialed Noah's number. He answered quickly, his voice full of concern. I told him that this would be my new number and, after a pause, shared the truth. I discovered Rachel's infidelity. Noah was silent, then asked what I planned to do. I explained that I'd already taken action. Packed my things, emptied the accounts, resigned, and was heading south to start over. I assured him that the divorce papers would be served by the end of the week. He asked if Honora knew, and I told him she didn't yet, but I'd keep him updated. We exchanged words of love and support, and I promised I'd stay in touch. With a heavy heart, I ended the call and prepared myself for the next conversation. It was time to tell Honora. Hearing the sadness in Honora's voice was gut-wrenching. As I broke the news about her mother's betrayal, she struggled to grasp how Rachel could bring such pain to our family, much like her sister Maya had. After a long silence, Honora finally spoke, her voice choked with hurt. "Dad, how long has this been going on? When did we stop being enough for her?" I tried to reassure her, telling her that the reasons and the length of time didn't really matter anymore. What mattered was that I had loved Rachel deeply and trusted her completely, and she had shattered that trust. I told Honora I would be all right, that I was sad but believed that with some time and distance, I'd find a way to heal. I promised to give her my new address and told her she could come visit once her school year wrapped up. The thought of Honora having a place with me brought tears to my eyes, but I needed her to know that she would always have a home with me. After I arrived in Tucson, I found work at a small optics division, a tight-knit group of about 30 employees. The district manager was a warm, fatherly man who fostered a real sense of camaraderie among the team. I felt welcomed right away, and that sense of belonging provided me with a much-needed refuge during this painful time. A month later, I found a modest, charming house in a quiet condo community. I avoided any contact with Rachel, getting updates only from my lawyer and from my kids. This new life had its struggles, though, and one of the biggest challenges came when my lawyer informed me that Rachel was planning to contest the divorce. She seemed determined to drag this out, even if it led to financial ruin for both of us. In response, I calmly told him to stop pursuing the divorce. I said I didn't care anymore. If she wanted a second chance to rebuild her life, I'd give her that. I also asked him to pass along a more blunt message, to tell her to go to hell. He chuckled, agreeing to relay the message, but warned there'd be a fee for extra services. Talking to my kids was even harder. I had to explain, one by one, that there was no going back. Honora was the first hurdle, telling me one day, "Dad, Mom freaked out when I said I wanted to stay with you this summer." I promised her I'd make the trip to visit her and her grandparents, but the intensity of her reaction was so unsettling that I had to put my phone away for a few days. Things only got worse when Noah decided he'd split his summer between us. I consciously avoided asking about Rachel, focusing on my own healing. Remnants of my feelings for her lingered, tied to the life we'd shared before everything fell apart. Over time, I learned more about her state of mind through my kids. To my surprise, she was apparently struggling with a deep depression, not unlike what I'd once gone through. Considering what she'd done to me and the family, It felt strange and even absurd. I couldn't help but wonder, how could she be this torn up when she was the one who destroyed everything? Her reluctance to finalize the divorce felt like an attempt to avoid facing the truth, to deny that her actions had shattered our family. It was ironic. I'd been in denial myself for a while, but she'd been living in her own version of it for years. She knew our kids were in regular contact with me, and she used them to express her remorse, saying she'd do anything to prove her love to me. I could see that Honora and Noah still hoped for a reconciliation, but I couldn't bring myself to speak with Rachel. The distance between us forced our children to choose between us, and she seemed relentless in her pursuit of information about my whereabouts. All she knew was that I'd settled somewhere in the South. Almost 3 years had passed since I left, and I thought I'd kept my new life hidden well. But one day, as I was leaving work, I spotted her lingering near the office building. My heart raced as I realized she'd somehow found me. The kids had hinted she believed a face-to-face meeting could change my mind, that she thought we'd make amends if we could just talk. Determined to correct that misconception, I quickly slipped out a side door and called Grace, letting her know what was happening. I needed to make it crystal clear to Rachel that she didn't have a place in my life anymore. I positioned myself so that Rachel could see me, leading her on a brief trail through the city. I stopped at a grocery store, making a show of casual errands, and then headed home. When I finally pulled into the driveway, Grace was waiting at the door, holding our 1-year-old baby in her arms. Rachel, having parked nearby, approached the house cautiously, visibly confused as she took in the scene. From where I stood in the kitchen, I watched her eyes widen as Grace greeted her warmly at the door, her voice carrying a distinct Spanish accent. "Can I help you?" Grace asked with a polite smile, holding our baby close. Rachel, caught off guard, stammered that she needed to speak with me. Grace called me over, and as I approached, I took the baby in my arms, facing Rachel with a look that was equal parts surprise and irony. Well, I began, allowing a hint of sarcasm to seep into my voice. "What brings you here after almost 3 years, Rachel?" Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she quietly said she'd come to apologize. She admitted her actions had been foolish and confessed that she deeply regretted the pain she'd caused. Her voice shook as she expressed her love for me, calling me the best husband and father a woman could ask for. Though her words felt genuine, I knew it was time to put an end to this. "It's all right," I replied, keeping my tone light and reassuring. "All of that's in the past now. I've moved on, and I forgive you." I looked down at the baby in my arms, whose innocent smile was a world away from this moment. "I hope you find the kind of love I have now," I continued. Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she murmured something I couldn't make out. She hesitated, then stepped forward to embrace me briefly before turning and walking back to her car. I closed the door behind her, feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Grace sensed my emotions and gently took the baby from my arms, then wrapped me in a comforting hug. She kissed my forehead, then reached for her phone. "I need to let Nathaniel know I'll be heading home soon with our daughter," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Thank you, Grace," I whispered, deeply grateful for her support. "And remind him I'll be at the barbecue on Saturday, ready to man the grill." "Will do, boss. I'll see you at the office tomorrow," she replied with a reassuring smile before heading out. The following week, my lawyer confirmed that Rachel had signed the divorce papers. Moving forward felt surreal but also liberating. I knew healing would take time, and I began to explore life again at my own pace. I gradually formed a few friendships with women, easing into casual relationships without any serious commitment. Over time, I felt my confidence grow, and I began to think that perhaps I was ready to let Grace introduce me to someone who could bring real happiness into my life. Yet, after this unexpected encounter with Rachel, I found myself doubting. Not my choice to leave as that was final, but my assumption that we'd had nothing left in common. I thought we had nothing more to discuss, believing she understood my stance on fidelity and how I'd react. But as I listened to fragments of her story during that brief conversation, I wondered if avoiding a full confrontation had left things unresolved. Even so, stepping away had been the right move. It allowed me the peace I needed to recover from the pain and toxicity that had surrounded us. Looking back, I knew that my love for Rachel had been deep enough that, had I seen her at my lowest point, I might have accepted her apology, only to face more heartache later. Now, 3 years after her betrayal, her apology finally gave me a sense of closure. It released me from the last remnants of bitterness and offered a small spark of hope for love again. I had finally unburdened myself, ready to step into a new chapter. But not for long. Yesterday, I found myself standing by Rachel's grave, surrounded by our children, relatives, and friends, including Maya. I wept bitterly, as did many others, but I noticed Maya's face remained dry. Rachel, in a moment of total despair and intoxication, had been in a fatal accident, and there was no saving her. I wrestled with the thought of why Maya had led Rachel down such a reckless path and found only one explanation: revenge. She had wanted payback for Rachel and me revealing her affair with Lucas, which had ultimately ended her marriage. Now, with Rachel lying in a casket, maybe Maya feels a twisted sense of relief.